Then you start again. So if that was the case, and I'm in Europe today, I don't think I will have any issue. Can you imagine Nwankwo playing the Olympics?
Nwankwo Kanu has won almost everything football has to offer. A Champions League title as a teenager, a Premier League crown, multiple FA Cups, Olympic gold, and 2 African Footballer of the Year awards. He's remembered for a towering frame paired with an almost delicate touch, and for one of the most famous individual comebacks in Premier League history. What's talked about far less is that most of that career happened after doctors told him at 20 years old that his heart could fail at any moment, and that the operation meant to save his life came with no guarantee he'd ever play again or even fully recover. Kanu grew up in Owerri in southeastern Nigeria in circumstances that had nothing to do with academies or coaching staff. Football there meant a ball, sometimes actual leather, sometimes just rags wound tightly together, and bare feet on hard, uneven ground. There was no one at the sideline offering instruction. No structured path forward, just kids organizing their own games as a way of getting through the day. It was in that setting, without anyone teaching him formally, that Kanu learned to control a ball in tight spaces, to read a game rather than force it, and maybe more importantly, to keep functioning when conditions gave him no reason to. Even as a boy, he wasn't the loudest presence on the pitch. He watched more than he talked. And when the ball came to him, he rarely rushed. He moved like someone who was used to waiting for the right moment rather than manufacturing one. That temperament didn't make him invisible, but it also didn't put him at the center of attention. And by most accounts, that suited him fine. Structure at home was thin. There wasn't room for much beyond discipline and repetition, but that in itself taught him something, that falling down wasn't an excuse to stay down, because nobody was going to stop the game to check on him, and the only way forward was to get back up on his own. That early self-reliance would matter more than anyone could have predicted, because the biggest threat to his career and his life wasn't going to come from an opponent on the pitch. It was going to come from inside his own chest. His move to Europe came fast with almost no preparation for the culture shock that followed. Ajax Amsterdam represented one of the most demanding academy environments in world football. And Kanu arrived without fluent Dutch, without familiarity with European training methods, and without the comfort of anything resembling home. The gap wasn't just linguistic. Daily life ran on completely different rhythms and expectations. Rather than force his way into that unfamiliar environment, he did what he'd always done. He watched, adjusted, and let his performances speak instead of trying to prove himself with words. It worked. His touch, his spatial awareness, and his calm under pressure started drawing real attention at a club known for producing world-class talent. And the timing turned out to be extraordinary during the 1994-95 season. Ajax won the UEFA Champions League with Kanu barely out of his teens, part of the squad that did it. It was an enormous marker for someone who'd been kicking a rag ball around unpaved streets a few years earlier. And that success brought a different kind of pressure. Kanu wasn't just representing a club anymore. He was increasingly framed as a symbol for African football broadly, someone whose success or failure carried weight beyond his own career. That kind of attention accumulates quietly, match after match, and for someone naturally inclined to keep things to himself, it meant absorbing pressure rather than talking through it. Around this same period, his body began sending small signals that nobody, including Kanu himself, took seriously: occasional breathlessness, fatigue that lingered longer than it should have after a match. In an environment where pushing through discomfort was treated as a baseline expectation, these signs were easy to write off, and he wrote them off along with everyone else. The full picture arrived only after he'd left Ajax for Inter Milan in 1996, in what looked like the natural next step for a player of his caliber. The move started the way these moves usually do: medical assessments, paperwork, preparations for a new season. But the standard physical exam turned into something else: Doctors ran further tests, conversations grew longer and more guarded, and eventually, Kanu was told he had a serious heart defect, one serious enough to put his ability to keep playing and potentially his life in question. At 20 years old, with a Champions League medal already behind him, he was suddenly facing a question that had nothing to do with football form or tactics, whether his body could safely continue operating at the intensity professional sport demanded. At all. The path forward wasn't obvious to anyone, including the specialists advising him. Continuing to play risked catastrophic consequences. Stopping meant giving up everything he built since he was a boy. Chasing a rag ball through the streets of Owerri, open-heart surgery became the only real option, not to extend his career, but to keep him alive. Reports at the time noted the seriousness of the procedure and the genuine uncertainty about outcome. When he went into the operating room, the question in front of him wasn't about minutes played or trophies won. It was simpler and heavier than that. Would he come back at all? He did come back, but not immediately, and not as the same physical presence he'd been before. The early recovery period was slow and unglamorous, relearning to sit up, to walk, to breathe deeply without discomfort. All of it stripped of any of the urgency or rhythm of professional sport. Football, which had defined nearly his entire identity up to that point, receded into the background simply because it was out of reach. While he recovered, the football world didn't pause to wait for him. Inter Milan's plans moved forward without him as a fixed piece. Other players took the opportunities that might have gone to him. There was no dramatic announcement that he'd been written off. It happened more quietly than that, through the accumulation of small decisions, fewer conversations about his role, more caution in how the coaching staff discussed his future, a gradual sense that trust in his fitness had been replaced by trust in players who didn't carry the same uncertainty. That period tested him in ways his career up to that point hadn't. He wasn't fighting for a starting spot against able-bodied competitors anymore. He was fighting to be considered reliable at all. Every training session came with a layer of self-monitoring. Was his heart rate responding normally? Was this fatigue ordinary or something to worry about? Could he trust his own body the way he once had without a second thought? There was no clear finish line to that process, no single date when doctors could say he was fully in the clear. It was a slow, uneven accumulation of small proofs, day after day, that he could still do this. It was Arsène Wenger who gave him a genuine path back into top-level football, signing him for Arsenal at a moment when many clubs would have considered the risk too high. What Kanu got at Arsenal that he hadn't fully had at Inter was time the room to rebuild gradually rather than prove himself instantly in a results-driven environment that rarely tolerates uncertainty. He didn't need to be the player he'd been before the surgery. He needed to become a workable version of himself that his body could actually sustain, and Wenger's setup allowed for that. The trust mattered as much as the training. After years of being treated as a medical question mark, simply being given playing time without the threat of instant judgment changed how he approached the game. He wasn't stepping onto the pitch anymore or trying to prove he wasn't a liability. For he was playing because he'd earned a place there, cautiously but genuinely rebuilt. That shift showed in his football, and less explosive than his pre-surgery self, but sharper in decision-making. More economical in his movement, still capable of the close control and vision that had made him stand out at Ajax in the first place. The clearest single moment of that Arsenal period came in October 1999 when Kanu scored a hat-trick against Chelsea in a legendary second-half comeback, turning a 2-0 deficit into a 3-2 win almost single-handedly in the space of a few minutes. It remains one of the most remembered individual performances in Premier League history, and for Kanu, it was more than a highlight reel moment. It was proof delivered on the biggest stage available to him. that the years since his diagnosis hadn't erased what he could do. What outside observers rarely saw was the ongoing management required to make performances like that possible. Every match still came with quiet calculation: how hard to push, when to hold back, how to read his own body's signals in real time rather than relying on instinct the way healthy players could. He wasn't playing with the same physical freedom he'd had before. What he'd developed instead was a kind of controlled, deliberate football built on positioning and timing rather than pure athleticism, and it turned out to be more than enough to make him effective at the highest level. His international career carried an added layer of weight. Kanu was part of the Nigerian squad that won Olympic gold in Atlanta in 1996, beating Brazil and Argentina along the way in a run still considered one of the greatest achievements in African football history. He was later named African Footballer of the Year, twice for Nigerian fans and for supporters across the continent more broadly. He wasn't simply a skilled player. He represented proof that African football could compete with and beat the traditional powers of the sport. That symbolism came with real pressure. Every appearance carried expectations that went beyond his own performance, and he carried that alongside a heart condition that most of his teammates and most of the public knew little or nothing about. He continued playing professionally for years after his return, moving through West Bromwich Albion and later Portsmouth, where he won another FA Cup in 2008. Even in those later seasons, the underlying reality hadn't changed. His body required more careful management than a typical professional's, longer recovery windows, more caution around intense training. He adapted his game accordingly, leaning increasingly on experience, positioning, and anticipation rather than pace or power. And it kept him competitive at a level that few assumed he'd reach when he first left the operating table in 1996. Perhaps the most significant part of Kanu's story isn't about football at all. Drawing directly on what he'd been through, he founded the Kanu Heart Foundation, an organization dedicated to funding heart surgeries for children in Nigeria and across Africa who have congenital heart conditions and no realistic access to the kind of treatment that saved his life. He understood, in a way few people can, exactly what it feels like to be told your heart might not hold, and what it means when someone makes that outcome survivable. The Foundation's work wasn't symbolic in the way many athlete-backed charities can be. It funded actual operations, connected families to hospitals and specialists, and over time expanded its reach well beyond Nigeria's borders into other parts of Africa. Kanu stayed personally involved rather than treating it as a name attached to a cause, meeting families, following individual cases, and showing up for the outcomes rather than just the launch. Every child who came through the program successfully was, in a very direct sense, someone standing where he'd once stood at 20 years old, unsure whether they'd get to keep living the life they'd started building. After retiring from professional football, Kanu didn't stay in the public eye in the way many former stars do. He stepped back from the constant visibility of top-level sport, spending more time with his family and appearing publicly, mainly around football alumni events or activities tied to the foundation. For someone who'd spent decades under intense scrutiny, first as a rising star, then as a medical question mark, and then as a player expected to keep proving himself, a quieter life wasn't a step down. It was closer to the first real stretch of stability he'd had since he was a teenager. The traces of everything he went through haven't disappeared. He still lives with the long-term realities of a serious heart condition and the surgery that addressed it. And that history is part of how he thinks about his own life now, less as something to be feared, more as a reminder to value the ordinary, unremarkable stretches of time that his younger self, lying in a hospital bed at 20, wasn't sure he'd get. What makes Kanu's career genuinely unusual isn't just a list of trophies, though that list is real. A Champions League title with Ajax, a Premier League title, and multiple FA Cups with Arsenal and Portsmouth, an Olympic gold medal with Nigeria, 2 African Footballer of the Year awards. It's that essentially all of it, after 1996, was built on top of a body that had already once come close to failing him completely. Most players who reach that level do it by relying on physical certainty. Kanu did it by learning to function without it, by turning constant self-monitoring, caution, and adaptation into a sustainable way of competing at the top of the sport for well over a decade, after doctors first raised the possibility that his career and his life might be over. Looked at as a whole, his story resists a simple, tidy summary, and maybe that's the most honest way to leave it. The same person who nearly lost his career and his life to a heart defect at 20 spent the following years scoring against elite opponents, representing his country on the biggest stages available to it, and eventually using his own history of fragility to fund heart surgeries for children he'd never met and would likely never know the outcomes of firsthand, except through the reports that came back. He wasn't protected from the thing that threatened to end everything. He learned deliberately and slowly how to keep going anyway, and how to turn what almost ended his life into something that would go on to extend other people's